Tonight on Nation to Nation, the Supreme Court of Canada will not hear from St. Anne's residential school survivors, dismissing their quest to access restricted documents of their time at the school. Longtime advocate Charlie Angus is disheartened.
Now the Supreme Court says, well, we're not even going to tell you why we don't think your case is worthy of merit. I think that is the worst slap in the face as well.
Devin Freeman committed suicide while in care nearly 5 years ago. Ontario inquest into his death is nearly finished. Lawyer Sarah Clark hopes the inquest recommendations fix widespread problems.
There is currently no data collected by the ministry or the agencies that tells us whether or not we're doing a good job when kids come into the system.
MP Gary Vidal is a Conservative critic for Indigenous services. He says it's a misconception that Indigenous voters should not trust his party.
I believe there's kind of a perception, I would call it, that I don't believe is reality out there, that we don't care about these issues, and we do.
Hi, I'm Fraser Needham, and I'll be your guest host on this week's episode of Nation to Nation. For years, survivors of St. Anne's Residential School in Northern Ontario have been fighting for access to documents from the school. The federal government says it has met its obligations in releasing school documents, but a number of survivors say this is not the case and have been battling the government in courts ever since. This morning, the Supreme Court of Canada denied an application to hear the case. Joining us today is NDP MP Charlie Angus, who has been working closely with St. Anne's survivors for a number of years. Welcome to the show, Charlie.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, so I guess the first thing is the decision just came down a few hours ago. What's your initial reaction?
Well, it is extremely disappointing that the Supreme Court of Canada has completely ignored the request by the St. Anne's survivors who had their cases, their hearings completely undermined because the government suppressed thousands of pages of police and court evidence. The government suppressed the names of the predators who committed horrific acts of violence and rape against these children. And this is a miscarriage of justice. But I was speaking with some of the survivors earlier, and the one thing they said is that they're not surprised. And I think that is a very telling statement for the reality of the word reconciliation in Canada under this government and under the courts.
Now, as we just discussed, the decision has just come down, but it has to be seen as a fairly major setback. So where do the survivors go from here?
I can't speak for the survivors on what they are going to do at this point, because every time the St. Anne's issue comes up, it is extremely traumatic for people who certainly lived through such horrific abuse. It's traumatic for their communities. It's traumatic for their families. I think one of the things that the St. Anne's survivors really wanted to show was that they weren't broken, that they were proud, and that they were going to stand up to Canada, and they have stood up to Canada. It's just that Canada's court systems continue to trust government when there should be no reason to trust government in terms of what has been done in the miscarriage of justice against Indigenous people, and certainly the ongoing injustice committed against the survivors of St. Anne's.
Okay, and you've been working on this case with survivors for a number of years, but maybe for our viewers that aren't so familiar with the case, why is it so important that the survivors get access to these documents?
Well, what the survivors wanted from the get-go was to be able to go into their hearings under the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement and say what had happened. That's what they were told was going to happen, and then they would be heard. And part of that process was that the government was supposed to produce any known evidence of crimes, and the government was sitting on 8,000 to 10,000 pages of police testimony identifying the perpetrators. And it was at the moment that these hearings occurred when the government suppressed the evidence and said, we've got no proof that anything ever happened to these children. That undermined the cases. Survivors weren't believed. It was very traumatic. Survivors were told they weren't truthful, and those cases were thrown out. So from the get-go, they have asked to have this miscarriage of justice addressed. And, in any other court system, if the lawyers for one party suppressed evidence and a hearing wasn't heard properly, there would be serious ramifications. But when the government of Canada does it, the courts have tended again and again to trust the government. Oh, there must have been a reason. Oh, they didn't really mean it. Oh, well, time to move on. They wanted this thing closed down. They want this notion of reconciliation to be a finished job. It's not. There is no reconciliation possible without justice for St. Anne's, and we still don't have that justice.
Now, of course, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land, so it appears at this point, the judicial system has been exhausted. Do you believe that putting political pressure on the government is the next best solution now to keep this going?
Well, for many years, we have tried to reach out to former minister, when Carolyn Bennett was minister. We've reached out to Mark Miller. We've really tried to get this out of the courts. It shouldn't have been in the courts in the first place. The government should have recognized that an injustice was committed when these hearings were falsely adjudicated and evidence suppressed. And we're talking about people who suffered some of the most horrific abuse. I couldn't say imaginable because it's not imaginable, the kind of abuse, rape, torture that was inflicted on these children who only crime in the eyes of Canada was that they were Indigenous. And the government, Mark Miller, should have said, an injustice has been done, let's sit down and find a solution. And that's never happened. And that's all the survivors, I think, wanted, was to get this out of court and have the government recognize and work with them and find some healing. But instead, they've had to fight all the way to the Supreme Court, and now the Supreme Court says, well, we're not even going to tell you why we don't think your case is worthy of merit. I think that is the worst slap in the face as well.
Okay, and I guess that brings me to the question of, why do you think the government continues to fight so hard against releasing all of these documents?
Well, it's not really clear what the government why the government identified these documents as something worth suppressing. There's certainly the names. We have some of the evidence and the names of priests and nuns and brothers and bishops who were involved and lay people. Did the government sign these non-disclosure agreements with the other defendant, the Catholic Church? The Catholic Church has been kept up to speed, and the Oblate Order and the Grey Nuns have been kept up to speed of every step of the way in this legal fight against the survivors. So is this a case that the Liberal government is continuing to protect the orders and the churches that caused these crimes? I'd like Minister Mark Miller to explain why we've had years in court over something so obviously egregious, so obviously unjust.
Okay, well, we have to end it there. And once again, Charlie, thanks very much for joining us, as always.
Thank you.
We'll be right back after a short break with lawyer Sarah Clark and her thoughts on the Devin Freeman coroner's inquest. Welcome back. The coroner's inquest into the death of 16-year-old Devin Freeman wraps up in Hamilton this week. The body of the teen was found hanging from a tree just meters away from the care home in Hamilton where he had been staying in April 2018. Freeman went missing from the home 6 months earlier. Joining us today from Hamilton is lawyer Sarah Clark, who is representing the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, Devin's home First Nation. Thanks for joining us today, Sarah, and welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, and so for our viewers, can you first outline for us some of the reasons why Devin's family and the Chippewas of Georgina Island petitioned the Ontario government so hard to have a coroner's inquest into his death?
That's a great question, Fraser. I think one of the reasons that the family and the First Nation worked so closely together to ask for this inquest was to get some answers about how a youth like Devin could die while in the care of the province. Not only that he could die while he was in the care of the province, but also how he could be missing for so long. As you know, he went missing in October of 2017. And his body was not discovered until April of 2018, hanging from a tree on the property of the care facility where he lived. So there were just so many unanswered questions. And I think the family and the First Nation wanted answers to those questions. But more importantly, I think, particularly from the family's perspective, They really wanted to shine a light on Devon's life, not just so that we remember Devon and the lessons that he's taught us, but so that this does not happen again. And that's what the inquest process really gives us, a real opportunity to submit recommendations and have the jury consider those so that they can make recommendations to everyone who's involved in the inquest so that something like this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, so we understand that there had been a lack of communication between police, the care home, and Children's Aid Society, and also the Ministry of Social Services in the months leading up to Devon's death. Was this something that the inquest tackled?
Absolutely. A lot of the evidence, particularly in the early weeks of the inquest, really sort of unpacked where the lack of communication was found. And it wasn't really in just one place. It really was between the Children's Aid Society and the care facility where he lived, as well as between the police. The other area of lack of communication that we really focused on was the lack of communication between the care facility, the Children's Aid Society, and the First Nation. So, for example, the First Nation never actually learned that Devon was missing in October of 2018, and they also never learned that he had died. That kind of information was not shared with the First Nation. So a lot of the evidence focused on that lack of communication, and then asked the witnesses who were involved in that process to think about ways that they could make a difference. How can we fix these communication cracks? And a lot of the evidence focused on that as well.
Now, we also understand that Chippewas of Georgian Island, through you, has made a number of recommendations that they would like the jury to consider. What do you feel are some of the most important ones worth noting?
Well, I think, first of all, it is important to highlight that there are a number of recommendations that were put forward together. All of the parties worked really hard together on the bulk of the recommendations. We call that a joint slate. And a number of the recommendations in that first batch of recommendations include things like making sure that the Children's Aid Society of Hamilton, for example, reaches out to the First Nations that it works with to develop a communications protocol so that all of the workers and the band representatives are very clear about how communication is going to work. There are also a lot of really good recommendations in the joint slate around problem solving, communication, and collaboration. You know, making sure that information around things like suicide ideation and suicide behavior are shared with the right people at the right time. And there are also some very good recommendations in the joint slate around involving family. One of the things we did hear throughout the evidence in this inquest is that Pamela Freeman, Devon's grandmother, was not brought in at various times while Devon was struggling when he was living at Linwood. So some of those recommendations focus on involving family and making sure they're at the table. So those recommendations, I think, are really strong, and every party to the inquest made very good concluding remarks of the last day or so to support those recommendations and sort of pointing to the evidence that the jury ultimately will need in order to make its decision.
Okay, and maybe you can outline, I understand that parties were in agreement, and that's not always the case at these inquests, but the Ministry of Social Services did not support a few of these recommendations. Could you talk about that a bit?
So what the ministry outlined today in their closing submission is that while they certainly support the joint slate, they cannot endorse the recommendations that are made in the second slate. And, you know, I would just say that I think it's still a little bit unclear the reason for all of that. One of the problems with an inquest process like this is that it is true that the recommendations have to be brought to the forefront very quickly. And so Ministry Council did talk about this being a very, very tight timeline to get instructions on things like funding. But I would say that from the First Nations perspective, you know, what we were really honored to see was the other institutional parties working so hard together to pull together and deliver these recommendations to the not to the ministry, but to the jury. So I think it remains to be seen what the jury will do. And ultimately, what's amazing about this process is these are community members here in Hamilton who have sat through 4 weeks of evidence. They have been, you know, really attentive and really, I think, interested in Devon's life and his legacy. And ultimately, they will have to decide what recommendations are made. But I think the First Nation was really pleased and heartened that everyone else besides the ministry was prepared to stand up and say that the recommendations in the second slate will and can make things better.
Okay, and as you say, the jury's in deliberations now, so we'll be watching to see what actual recommendations they decide on when they come back. And we'll have to leave it there for now. But thanks again, Sarah, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Fraser. Take care.
We know this is a difficult issue, and if you or anyone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts, you can contact the Suicide Crisis Hotline at 1-833-456-4566. That's 1-833-456-4566. And we'll be right back with Conservative MP and Indigenous Services Canada critic Gary Vidal. Hi, I'm Fraser Needham, and I'll be your guest host on this week's episode of Nation to Nation.
Nakumik, thank you, Mr. Chair.
All this week, a House committee has been looking at Bill C-29. It'll create a national reconciliation body that in turn will monitor how well the TRC's calls to actions have been implemented. Sitting on that committee is Conservative MP Gary Vidal. He's also the shadow minister or critic of Indigenous Services. Vidal joins me now to talk about Bill C-29 and some of the changes in the Conservative Party now that they have a new leader. Mr. Vidal, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Fraser. My pleasure.
As you know, Bill C-29 is now at the committee stage, and the Conservative Party has some issues with that. What are some of the issues that the Conservative Party has with the legislation?
Probably the first thing I would talk about, Fraser, is just the sense of independence. The whole goal of Call to Action 53 is to create an independent body, and what the government is suggesting we do is create an actual non-profit corporation that will be that independent body. But the problem with independence is how the process of electing the board of directors or selecting the board of directors is made. And what we see is that the government back in 2018 ultimately appointed this interim board of directors, which started a bunch of the work, which they completed in June of 2018. It wasn't until December of 2021 when they followed up with the appointment of what's called the Transitional Committee, which was one of the recommendations out of that interim board. And finally, that Transition Committee now has got us to the place where we have some legislation to consider. In that legislation, the minister is actually responsible to select the first board of directors of this entity. And so it does say kind of in collaboration with the Transition Committee, but if you look at the process, it's always been the government or the minister that's appointing the people, and then they will ultimately appoint the first board of directors, and the first board of directors is ultimately responsible to create the process for the election of future boards of directors. So there seems to be a situation where the minister has his thumbprint all over this and ultimately controls the process, and we're seeing some real concerns in Indigenous leadership and in communities with that lack of independence.
Okay, and let's say if you were in government and Conservatives in government, how would you touched upon a few of the issues, but how would you have drafted this legislation differently? Well,
I think, there's actually an interesting element to this that I'm still working on, Fraser. The interim board that created a final report way back in June of 2018 included 20 very specific recommendations, and in those recommendations, or part of that report, it's my understanding that there was actually a draft copy of a proposed bill already back then, but that draft copy of the bill is nowhere to be found anymore. So I'm still trying to get my hands on that. And I would actually really be curious to see what that interim board of directors recommended for the process to elect this first board of directors. I understand that it's complicated, but the other challenge, honestly, is that there's a section in the legislation that talks about how there should be a diverse representation on this board of directors, but there's a qualifying clause that says after 5 years. So I think one of the things that I would suggest is why don't we endeavor to appoint that diverse board of directors that is very representative of people across the country, regions, different groups, Indigenous people on the ground, not just the national organizations. Why don't we do that right away instead of after 5 years? That would be one of the things that I would work towards.
Okay, as you know, you're back in Parliament now and you're pressing the government on a number of issues. But what as we draw to the end of this year, what are some of the issues that the Conservatives will be pressing the Trudeau Liberals on?
Well, I think our message has been pretty clear over the last few weeks. I mean, cost of living, right? Cost of living is the huge factor that I don't care where you live in Canada, whether it's a remote Indigenous community or downtown urban center somewhere, the cost of living is becoming a huge issue for people. We've been talking about things that contribute to that. Hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in the economy that has created a demand for goods, and like our leaders talking about, we need to create more goods, not more money to buy select or fewer goods. So that idea, we've been talking a lot about the tripling of the carbon tax, where let's take a riding like mine in northern Saskatchewan, Fraser, where everything on a shelf everywhere in my riding has a huge freight component. And the carbon tax and the associated increase in the cost of freight is directly affecting the cost of those items on the shelf. I mean, some of my flying communities, a gallon of milk is $14. A kilogram of apples is $12. A dozen eggs is $9 at some of these communities. And the freight cost and the tripling of the carbon tax is going to drive that even higher. So cost of living is going to be something you hear from us, I think, consistently over the next few months.
Okay, and now I'd like to move on to your new leader. Of course, Mr. Poilievre has replaced Aaron O'Toole, and that happened last month. What are some of the specific Indigenous issues or policies that you'll be promoting under the new leadership?
I think you've heard Mr. Poilievre talk about, I think economic reconciliation is one of those, right, where he wants to see them be able to be part of a prosperous economy, be participating in projects, but not just the large natural resource projects, but like, for example, again, I'm going to go back to my riding again. There's some really, really good things happening in forestry. There's some good things happening in mining. There's some good things happening in a number of sectors. And our goal is to have Indigenous people be full-on participants in that prosperous economy, and back to what I said, and lead to the investment and the success of their own communities and their own organizations, their own businesses, their own entrepreneurs.
Right, and maybe I'll just move to sort of the broader issue. Now, of course, as you know, in the West, Conservatives are very strong. They're very strong in Saskatchewan, hold all the seats. Mm-hmm. But in order to win an election in this country, you have to win Ontario and Quebec. And really, Conservatives have had this trouble recently in Ontario with the Liberals winning around the GTA. On that front, what do you think the party really needs to do to sort of break through maybe and to win the next election?
I think the cost of living issue that I talked about earlier is going to be huge, because that affects everybody no matter where you live, right? And people are going to see us as the party that can address that issue better than maybe some of the others. I think the other thing is we have to have a heart on some of the issues that maybe we've been perceived not to have in the past, and the Indigenous file is one of those, where we have to bring real solutions and real relationships to the table to convince people that we have a heart for those issues as well. And I think we can do that. I think we are that party that can do that.
Okay, well, thanks very much for joining us today, and as always, a pleasure.
My pleasure, Fraser. Thank you.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. Next week, Lindsay Richardson will be back as your guest host. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Thank you and good night.